1. Order. Well, welcome everybody to the latest meeting of the Environmental Audit Committee and particularly to our inquiry on governing the marine environment. Very grateful to our panellists for joining us today. Can I start by asking you, starting with you, Ms Godwin on my left, to introduce yourselves and your organisations and interest in this area.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me along today. My name is Jennifer Godwin, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer for the Seabed User and Developer Group. We are an informal grouping of some of the UK's key marine industries. So we bring together the trade body organisations for, I have to make sure I remember them all now, so the port sector, the subsea cable sector, offshore renewables, oil and gas. We have leisure boating and marinas, we have marine aggregate extraction, we have carbon capture storage. I hope I've remembered them all. I'll be in a lot of trouble if I haven't. So we bring everyone together, and we are primarily united with a desire to deliver sustainable marine development. And we look across the piece at different government policy that impacts the marine environment and try and seek those win-win solutions so we can have thriving marine industries and a thriving marine environment at the same time.
Right. Dr. Harper.
Good afternoon, pleasure to be here. I'm Gemma Harper. I'm the Chief Executive of the Joint Nature Conservation Committee. JNCC is the UK Statutory Advisor on Nature. Thank you.
Very much. Mr. Cunningham.
Gareth Cunningham. I'm Director of Conservation and Policy at the Marine Conservation Society.
Excellent. Well, thank you again. Firstly, our marine protected areas are designed to provide an ecologically coherent and well-managed network to support the protection of our marine environment. Can I start with you, Dr. Harper? To what extent do you believe that they are doing that? And what do you see as the role that they're playing in UK waters?
Thank you, Chair. I'd start by saying the middle of the last century we didn't have any marine protected areas, so actually we have come a long way. It has taken time, the science has taken time, the identification of sites, the designation, and now well into management measures. So I would say it's something to be very proud of that the UK has 38% of our UK waters in marine protected areas, using that designation that is based on identification using OSPAR, which is the Regional Seas Convention's principles, as you mentioned, being ecologically coherent is incredibly important. So we have a scientifically robust set of principles that underpin a representative UK network of marine protected areas. So we have the identification and we have the designation. The domestic and regional and international commitments, though, aren't just about quantity, they are about quality. And so what's been really important is to ensure effective management measures in those marine protected areas. And various bodies are in the process of establishing that, whether that's fisheries management measures through bylaws or regulation of other form. So I would say we have come a long way in terms of designation. We have got further to go in terms of management. I think the latest assessment by OSPAR is about 20, maybe 22% of those marine protected areas are moving towards the protection that they intended to have, and maybe about another 39-40% is partially there. So we're not yet at 100% of the 38%.
Yes, and obviously with a 30% kind of commitment, we actually have sort of 22% of the 38%. Yeah. Thank you very much. Mr. Cunningham, from your perspective, what would you add to what we've just heard there, and how well do you think it's working at this stage?
I think Gemma's given a really comprehensive answer of what they cover. I think in terms of progress, as we've heard, management is the key issue. We're almost there, I would say, with designation. There are some gaps, particularly around seabirds. There's some gaps in the network there which will be holding up some of the developments which Jennifer may talk to. I think the other thing we need to remember is MPAs don't exist in isolation. We've talked about a coherent network, but that is also part of the delivery for good environmental status, one of the 11 descriptors we need to deliver against. So we can't just focus on delivery of MPAs. It's really important. They're the jewels within the crown, but we need to make sure that we manage the rest of our seas to enhance those areas and make sure we achieve GES.
Okay, thank you very much. And Ms Godwin, from your perspective, firstly, how well do you think the marine protected areas approach is working? Is the clarity for your very diverse membership about what that means?
I think it's a very good question. I think that to an extent there's clarity in the theory, but I think when it comes to the practice, industries don't necessarily have all the information that they need when they're going through the process. And what I'm probably getting at there is, in terms of designation, we have a complete suite of different types of protected areas. In terms of understanding exactly what's going on in those protected areas, understanding the status, understanding how those habitats are evolving, we don't have a clear picture because we don't have a lot of monitoring activities going on, and so often it's put into the responsibility of industry as they're going through an application process to collect data on the protected sites. And so I think from an industry perspective, we would like to see more active management of the sites, and I think that would support industry members in going through their consenting processes.
In terms of sort of communication and mutual knowledge, do you feel like your membership would consider that government and those who are sort of primarily interested in marine conservation understand each other's mutual needs and expectations in terms of marine protected areas? Do you think there is a good enough dialogue between the sort of multitude of different actors in this space?
Another good question. I think that the industry members that I work with and lots of the senior colleagues within arm's length bodies, government, do have a really good understanding of each other and each other's perspective. I think that there are lots of really fantastic people within Gemma's organisation, the MMO, Natural England. I think that the challenge comes from a lack of understanding more at the coalface, with the actual licensing process. So I think there isn't always that understanding throughout, but I think at the strategic level, more so.
Yeah, okay. Dr. Harper, could you just give us a sense as to how the UK government compares with some of the sort of similar nations, similar sized nations, in terms of the approach we've taken to this area?
I think we compare very favourably from a science perspective, absolutely. We have some of the best scientists, and you're going to hear from some of them in the next panel, in the world. And our marine science capability and capacity is at the cutting edge. And particularly for JNCC, which is a science organisation, and our partners work very closely with OSPAR and invest a huge amount of time and energy in supporting OSPAR assessments. So I think from that perspective, we do particularly well. From an outcome perspective for the marine environment, it relates back to my first point about it's fantastic we've got the designation. So we have already, from a designation point of view, exceeded the 30 by 30 target, but that's only part of the picture. We've still got to progress further with management measures, and we've also got to be able to adapt to new science as it emerges. So adaptive management is incredibly important. We may well come on to whether it's features-based or whole site-based, but our understanding of the ecosystem and our dependency on it has never been better. I think that has really informed the global biodiversity framework, which was heralded as the Paris moment for nature, and I absolutely think it is. And the target on 30 by 30 is at least 30% of the global ocean in protected and conserved measures by 2030. So we have the right ambition, and the UK government has been at the forefront of that ambition, whether through the Global Ocean Alliance or the High Ambition Coalition. So politically the appetite has been there, scientifically the appetite has been there. I think what we'll come on to is the gap in implementation and delivery.
Yeah, and on that topic of implementation and delivery, great to hear we've got world-class science, great to hear we've got, world-leading legislation. In terms of what we've actually delivered in terms of those marine protected areas and the quality of that, how does that compare on a global stage?
I think I couldn't give you a direct set of figures, but we're very happy to follow up on that.
Okay.
I think we are putting in place fisheries management measures which are aimed to be effective. I think where we've got evidence where you take particular measures like banning bottom trawling in Lyme Bay, you can see that that's effective in terms of nature recovery. Timescale is a challenge here. So these ecosystems have developed over a very long time. Yeah. It will depend on the amount of damage that's done to those ecosystems, the extent to which you need the right set of management measures to recover. So it does take time to evaluate and compare. I couldn't give you a league table of where the UK is in relation to other countries. I would say that we've got all the right ingredients and all the right foundations, yeah. But we do need more coordinated governance, and we need more adaptive management, and we most definitely need spatial prioritisation.
Thank you. Well, we'll come on to that. Mr. Cunningham, you referred to seabirds as one kind of emission. Are there any other ecosystems which are essential to the UK's marine environment which you feel aren't properly covered by the current framework?
As I say, broadly, we have the majority of what we call the features of conservation interest covered within the network. Scotland has recently designated a great deal of sites, which marries that up, and I know Wales is going to look to complete its part of the network towards the end of next year after their elections. So, as I say, in terms of coverage, we are very much there. Going back to the OSPAR, one of the key things within there is resilience and replication, and making sure we have redundancy. Climate change is something we cannot address very quickly, so we must make sure that where we have sites, we're looking after them. But we also need to think about other effective conservation measures which can complement the network, not instead of. I am slightly concerned that we're still talking about designations, not really ramping up the talk about management. Yeah. We are absolutely exceptional at producing plans and policies, and they are really good. Where they fall down is on the delivery. And in some parts, that is not the fault of the statutory agencies because they are not funded enough to deliver this. We've seen a decrease in that funding, and that's what's really needed to make sure we ramp up the ambition and actually start to get these networks in good condition.
Yeah, and today we've heard an announcement from the Chancellor, I don't know if people have had the opportunity to hear it, but on new designations. Is that something, and spoken about in the context of growth and offshore wind, is that something that you welcome, that you're concerned by, or what was your reaction to that?
So only briefly seen it, but initial reaction, it's always good to see progress in terms of things that have lagged behind. In response to the ambition around offshore wind, I think the biggest barrier we have is not knowing where any remaining gaps are going to fall. So developers have uncertainty there. Are they investing in an area that may have future restrictions? But also, we'll get to it, I imagine. Marine planning isn't there in the format it needs to be to support this. What we're doing currently is identifying areas to protect, but then not really thinking about what activities are suitable or the cumulative impacts of existing activities.
Yeah, Ms. Godwin, in terms of that announcement, is it something you're aware of? Yeah. What was your response to it?
So, very welcome from an industry perspective. As I understand it, again, I just had a chance to glance at it, but as I understand it, it's linked to the challenges of delivering offshore wind farms, and it will be, so identifying these new sites will be directly linked to the strategic compensation that will come in through under the habitats regulations for new wind farms. So it's a very specific need, and of course it's necessary to compensate for the impact that those projects would be having to the existing sites.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're going to come on to...
That's existing sites on a marine, marine
existing
protected
sites, existing marine protected
And
areas.
I mean, Dr. Harper, is this something that you think is a necessary sort of catch-up, or is it something that causes you concern in terms of an undermining of existing areas?
There's the announcement today from Minister Hardy is very welcome. I think we all know that we're not going to achieve net zero without nature recovery, and we're not going to achieve nature recovery without net zero. But we've got to go high nature and low carbon. So it can't be acceleration of offshore wind at any cost, and I don't think anyone is suggesting that. So anything that helps us get that double win is welcome. I think, as with anything, the intent looks really strong and really good. It's going to be the implementation and then the management within those marine protected areas or extended areas, and importantly, the point that Gareth made, the monitoring. Because if we don't monitor effectively, we're not going to know what's happening. We're not going to know if management measures are effective or whether or not we've achieved national or international targets. And so investment in monitoring is a really important aspect to this.
Thank you. Very good.
Thank you, Chair. You're silver-tongued, you two, aren't you? Look, just 3 weeks ago, the Office of Environmental Protection announced that it was investigating DEFRA in relation to its suspected failure to take the necessary measures to achieve or maintain good environmental status. Now that goes to the fact that of the 15 descriptors of good environmental status for the marine environment, they found that only 6 were improving out of those 15. That's improving. That's not where they should be. It's just improving. So the distinction that you rightly make between designation and management and implementation and monitoring that management and implementation, when we do monitor it, as the OEP has done, what we find is that we're not doing what we should be doing. We're falling down on the implementation. And that's why so many people look at this and say, well, hey, you can call it what you like, but it's just a line on a map. It's a paper park. So what I want to do is I want to ask you, in relation to the question that the chair put to you about how it is that we've just seen announced these new MPAs, new marine protected areas, in order to get 16 gigawatts of offshore wind. Well, what we need to know surely is, where is that 16 gigawatts of offshore wind going to be? Is it going to be on what are only 3 highly protected marine areas, on Allenby Bay, the Northeast Farnes Deep, or Dolphin Head? Because my understanding was that they could not be utilised for that. Or are they going to be on some of the other MPAs? And you see, when the public look at this, they say, oh, it's a marine protected area, that means it's protected. But we all know that it doesn't mean that it's protected. It means that it has certain things that may be protected in it. So, are you able to give us any further information about what it is and where it is that the 16 gigawatt of offshore wind is going to be sited, and what we're going to lose by it, and what is going to replace it? Because under biodiversity net gain, we should be gaining here, not losing.
Would you like me to?
You can start.
Am I one of the silver-tongued?
You're both.
Okay. We are part of nature. So nature conservation is about conserving us as much as it is about conserving every other species on this planet. And
I think our species has done more damage to the rest of nature than any other species that has ever lived. And we are in danger. If you look at the World Wildlife Curve, what is it, 70%, 69% of species populations have been depleted in the last 50 years. So I don't think that the preservation of us should be the top of our list. We preserve ourselves by preserving nature.
I agree. I absolutely agree. What I'm trying to articulate is I don't think it's been helpful for us to externalise nature from us in the past. And that links to the point about spatial prioritisation. If we've got limited space, whether that's at sea or land, and multiple uses of that limited space, then what we need to see is a movement from marine planning, which is simply descriptive of those multiple uses, to marine planning, which is much more prescriptive about how that space should be used. And that is going to depend on what we as a society value. So I can't answer the specifics, Mr. Gardo. Apologies about where these are going to be right now, but I can tell you, I can assure you that JNCC's role is to provide the scientific evidence as to whether or not proposals about where this development is going to be will cause environmental damage or not, and we will do so, and we will do so with integrity. The challenge is that is advice to the regulators. The regulators do not need to act on our advice, and sometimes we don't know, because it's not transparent enough, what has happened to that advice. Therefore, what is the process through which that advice has been considered and evaluated.
That's very interesting. So would it be something that you would like to see this committee recommend, that when advice is given by the JNCC, then the government or the regulator in this case, should be obliged to respond to that advice and say how they've accounted for it and taken it on board? Would that be helpful?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Cunningham.
I'd agree with that as well. I think one of the key things we're talking about here is the absence of a clear hierarchy of decision making. We have decisions made around how much energy we require. That is not always collated against other targets we have within government, and that creates a conflict for space, but also on an already degraded ecosystem. We've talked to net gain there. That's in addition to the mitigation compensation hierarchy. If we're looking to designate new sites to offset damage to current ones, that's not gain, that's replacement. And that's where we start to fall down on delivering a coherent network. We're only really then replacing what we've lost, not the additionality.
So again, if this committee were making comment in that area, we should be emphasising that there must be net gain, when not only to offset the damage, but actually to provide increased benefit and sustainability. Under the Marine and Coastal Access Act 2009 and the Habitats Regulations, there's the possibility for derogation on some of the marine protected areas. Can that derogation apply to our 3 highly protected marine areas?
Really good question. I don't think it's ever been brought to case law. We've seen it in terms of the Habitats Regulations. On principle, it shouldn't. They're meant to be strictly protected. Of course, that may be a different view from a legal perspective, which I don't think I could talk to. I think the other crucial thing is as well that if we go back to the Habitats Regulations, we've obviously derogations, de minimis, I think is the terminology we use. 1% is okay. If that happens 100 times, the site is gone. And what we've seen is this impact from cumulative impacts. So we really need to get a hold on what is the need for the environment, ecological headroom, and make space for that, not just for more development.
Really important point about cumulative impacts. How would we take that on board in this committee and make that a recommendation to government?
I think Gemma will be able to talk to that, because JNCC is currently developing a piece of work around it.
That would be really helpful.
I think it's incredibly important. So sectors have evolved largely separately, and we understand the reasons for that. It comes back to the point about how they're regulated, and they're regulated often by separate bodies. And so you have quite a fragmented way of governing the marine environment. And we know that there are a number of pressures on the marine environment that I'm sure you've already received evidence about. So we're often thinking about dealing with those pressures individually, but actually it is the cumulative effect and the multiplicity of those pressures, coming back to the spatial prioritisation, which will help us within any given space of seabed, and if you want to take a whole site approach, which we should through the water column and the wider ecosystem, that we would have a better understanding through modelling those multiple impacts. And then that would lead you to a potentially different set of options about where you would locate new development.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I don't want to pass over the equally important point that you made in the course of that, where you were talking about, at the moment, we have designation of features rather than adopting a whole site approach. And again, if you wanted to suggest to the committee in writing afterwards recommendations that we could make that would pick up both of those things, that would be extremely helpful. Now, the Benyon review of highly protected marine areas, I think welcomed the three that we've got, but said that ultimately we needed to implement many more than the three initial sites. I think their recommendation was that it should be 10%, covering at least 10% of English waters within the wider MPA network should be highly protected. These ones where derogation could not apply. What is your view about the Benyon review and what it said there?
The Benyon review, sorry, Gemma,
can I go? Yeah, so I think from an industry perspective, we really welcomed the Benyon review, and one of the celebrated parts of it was that industry were very involved in the designation process. I think we've welcomed the three sites that have been designated, but I would definitely say that the industry feeling on this is that we need to make sure that those sites are working first before we start looking for further opportunities to designate.
Difficulty with that, though, Ms. Godwin, is that in the meantime, other potentially important sites for highly protected marine areas could be disintegrating in the course of while we wait and see how it's going with the highly protected ones. I would have thought the precautionary principle should cut in, and we should say, well, these are the ones that we're thinking about protecting. Let's not do anything there for the moment. We'll see how the highly protected ones go, and then we can make a more informed decision about these ones that we're thinking about. Do you not think that would be a better approach?
I think that we need to have a pragmatic and balanced approach, and we could possibly identify large areas of the sea and say there's potential here. But then it comes back to that conversation of, what do we want from our seas? What do we want from our marine industries? How do we balance those two pressures or choices? So I think, yes, the precautionary approach applies to an extent, but we already have...
Well, we're only talking about a maximum of 10% of the English waters, aren't we? That's what the Benyon Review recommended. So if we're talking about establishing... that it does leave you 90% for our balanced approach, which I wholly support.
I'm going to kind of cycle back to some of the previous discussions that we were having about having this broader, holistic plan of where everything should go. And I think we're making some really important progress at the moment in considering that. We've talked briefly about prioritisation. I don't think we've progressed that completely yet, but the work that the Crown Estate's doing on the whole of Seabed and gathering evidence and the marine delivery route map starts looking at these potential important areas and is mapping them alongside potential important areas for marine development. So we're starting to build that evidence base. We haven't got the framework in place yet with government to make the decisions, and we haven't got, it still needs work, but we're starting to build the evidence base that could inform that. So it doesn't mean that
we have the best marine science in the world, so I'm sure the evidence base is out there. Maybe we just need to gather it together a bit quicker.
Yeah.
If I can move to, we've touched on regulation and enforcement, the implementation, the management regimes, and I think you've said that at the moment they are perhaps less than perfect. Could you highlight, Dr. Harper or Mr. Cunningham, any of the particular weaknesses that you see in the current regime? We've talked about features rather than whole site designation. That may well be one, but other weaknesses in the regime.
Happy to start. Yes, we're absolutely. Let's move away from offshore wind and look at the other impacts we have. obviously fishing is going to be one that people will be very interested.
I don't want to.
In terms
I know
of
that one of my colleagues is going to be asking a question.
I was going to move away from fishing. Don't worry. I think one of the big gaps we have is we do not yet currently monitor the extent that we should. There were recommendations from OSPAR and announced today in Minister Hardy's announcement about the impacts of chemicals and water quality, but we are not doing enough to address that. There are an awful lot of promises, and there is significant progress through the Water Special Measures Act, but, for example, we are not matching up with the REACH initiative from Europe. Forever chemicals and other toxins have a huge impact on the marine environment and do not respect site boundaries. There is a large gap in terms of tackling those at source, but also monitoring their impacts in the long term as well.
And you're not talking about the dredging in the northeast that saw the die-off there, or that didn't see the die-off there?
I think that's a good example where we need more monitoring to actually get to the bottom of what the issues are. Let's be honest, spoil are going to be an issue as we increase the depth of our harbours. We construct more on the seas. We need to understand where they go and also what the impacts are, in addition to all the other chemicals that go into the sea.
So chemicals in particular, pollution, yeah.
I was just going to contribute, if that's okay, Mr. Gardner. So our assessment would be, we have good legislation, we have a good set of regulations. It's a permissive system, and rightly in the sense of it does have to be about sustainable use of natural resources, as we are part of nature and we depend on nature for a good number of things. The question really is all of that effective? And you've already said, and I completely agree with you, whether it's a UK marine strategy or it's OSPAR marine assessments, the UK seas are in poor condition, and you've already cited the not meeting the basket of measures. So at the same time as that, we've got lots of legislation, we've got lots of regulation, we've got amazing science, we've got poor outcomes, and we've got growth in development and industry and competing requirements of our marine environment. So we're not turbocharging, whatever the right phrase is, nature recovery. And actually HPMAs are the latest in the evolution of our understanding about how if you take an ecosystem approach, you may get better outcomes. So on the point about HPMAs, very much welcome the Benning Review, would love to see it fully implemented. So really it's got to be, how do you make what we've already committed to doing? It is the environmental principles in England or equivalent in the other countries. It's how do you integrate nature into every decision? How do you take account of nature? How do you ensure that there is really good understanding of why nature matters? Coming back to the public understanding of this, nature matters in and of itself, but nature matters for a lot of other reasons as well. And these natural systems, I don't completely love the analogy, but if we start to think about natural blue and green systems as national infrastructure, and we understand it as national infrastructure, and we evaluate it and value it as national infrastructure, as we do for everything else that we depend on economically and socially, and we integrate that, then we probably would be in a better place. It doesn't completely work because it still externalizes nature from people, but it's probably the best way to proceed.
Thank you. I think the descriptor review has set out very clearly the dependence that we have and the way in which we should be regarding natural capital as national infrastructure in that sense. Finally, I just want to press you on the fact that you seem to be saying we have all the ingredients and we know what the recipe is, but somehow we're not getting the cake right. Is that because we're just bad chefs? Is it because there is a lack of resource being put into this? Is it because we're not enforcing strenuously enough, or we're not we haven't got the baselines in place that we need? What is it that's stopping us achieving, with all the good things that you've said, the outcomes that we're seeking?
At the risk of torturing the analogy, there are too many cooks. So we absolutely need a just transition for both climate and nature. It needs to be equitable. It needs to take communities first approach. We know that marginalised and racialised people here and around the world will suffer the most. So this is not a point about equity, but it is a point about a fragmented system where you've got that level of fragmentation and this level of complexity. It's very difficult to articulate to anyone how the marine environment is governed because it's so complex. You've got this level of fragmentation, this level of complexity. You've got competing requirements, whether it's coming from industry or elsewhere. That is a recipe for inaction. It's too confusing.
So who should be doing it, and what recommendations should this committee be making to government?
UK government has made a commitment to all 23 targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Under Target 1, they've committed to an ocean sustainability plan. The development of that ocean sustainability plan should address a much simpler, coordinated governance system. Using what we have, let's not create more governance and more bureaucracy. Let's simplify it, let's coordinate it better. Let's make sure we build in the ability to adapt to new science. Let's make sure that we spatially prioritise and that we invest in monitoring.
I think that's some great recommendations there for us. Yeah, sorry.
No, if I may add to that, I think that's really sensible. I think one thing we risk, we've had the Act since 2009 for the Marine Act, creating more policy and coordinating that into a really quick and easy way to deliver is brilliant. But the two things we mustn't forget is there are some easy recommendations we can put forward that can make a significant change now, and we shouldn't pause those in order to write more policy. We must get on an act, and funding absolutely is crucial to this. We have missed the 2020 targets, and we're likely to miss 2030. The public purse alone will not pay for this. There are a lot of bills for the government to pay. We need to be smart about how do we bring in sensible, high-integrity investments to make sure that the marine environment does actually become a natural asset that we enhance and use to underpin the environment.
You segued perfectly to Ms Godwin to finish off.
I would finish off by saying that all of these things would need to be captured in an update to the UK Marine Policy Statement, which is, I think, over 11 years old. And we need that clear vision for how we as the UK want to use our seas and what the various targets are that are across the different government departments and how it all comes together in the marine space, because there's a real lack of holistic planning in the marine system, and a lack of understanding perhaps between how policy is developed on land and how that might have implications for the marine. And so I think the join that
and
through.
Holistic view.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Chris Hinchcliffe.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Harper, can you tell us a bit about how the UK government works with devolved nations to deliver commitments such as 30 by 30 in the marine space?
Pleasure to. JNCC was born out of devolution, and we are constituted by the UK government and the devolved governments. So we are as much Scottish as we are English, as much Welsh as we are Northern Irish. And the statutory nature conservation bodies of the 4 countries make up the JNCC board. So this is in our DNA. So actually Joint Committee, which is the board of JNCC, is one of the areas where the 4 countries come together. There are members of the statutory nature conservation boards on our board. There is a whole lot of governance related to that from a statutory nature conservation perspective. So we have very good coordination amongst the conservation agencies and indeed with NGOs and industry and academia within the 4 countries. There is an interministerial group which you will be aware of. I had the pleasure of attending that when it met before Christmas and was chaired by the DEFRA Secretary of State. It was a very positive meeting, very open and huge commitment to collaboration. And that's really important. We've seen that in response to the Global Biodiversity Framework. We need to see that in relation to the marine environment continue. So we have a UK marine strategy. We understand that the marine environment is really dynamic. It doesn't respect 12 nautical miles or even 200 nautical miles. It is a global ocean, and it is one global ocean circulating this planet. It's a really important message. We name different bits of it, but it is all connected. It is all the lifeblood of the planet. what the four countries, so environmental policy has devolved, what that gives you is a greater sensitivity in country to what's going on in that area and in the marine environment, notwithstanding it is a dynamic environment. It also gives you the opportunity for natural experiments, because we've all got the same outcome, 23 targets in the Global Biodiversity Framework, but each of the countries is doing things slightly differently, which is absolutely legitimate. So you can then look at what's working here, what's working there. So for Scotland, for example, there is a commitment on deep sea reserve. It's going to be really interesting to see what works there. Excuse me. You have in Wales the Future Generations Act, and that being applied to policy making. You have the environmental principles in England. So I think there's differences we can learn from. Having been at JNCC for 4 years, I would say that we do need stronger cooperation and collaboration at the political and policy level to match what we have at the scientific level. So that point about, yes, we have a diversity of voices, a diversity of policies, but actually it's one global ocean. We all should be pushing in the same direction. So there is governance between the devolved governments and the UK governments. There is the interministerial group. There's the science that wraps around that. We would only want to see that cooperation strengthened, and actually not to see compromise as a failure. Compromise can move us forward if it's done in a collaborative and co-created way.
Thank you very much. I can see some nodding on either side of you there, so maybe slightly broaden out my welcome contributions from anyone in this, but to sort of specify then, would you say that the approach across the four nations is integrated and aligned? And would you say there is any room for improvement in the collaboration? And would there be any opportunities, you think, for this committee to make recommendations for improving those ways of working? Mr. Cunningham?
And I'm sure Jen has some thoughts too. There's always room for improvement. Let's be honest. While we share the legislation, particularly England and Wales, the delivery is not always the same, and at times we see curtailing of ambition to go further. For example, within fisheries, the minimum landing size may differ depending on where you land your fish, whether it's in Devon or whether it's in Swansea. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the same species of fish. We need join up there, same ecosystem. The marine planning system is not identical, yet we don't have full devolution around the deployment of offshore energy, and that can create conflict in terms of the resourcing within nations to assess that from an environmental point of view. Wales has far fewer civil servants to address that, which causes hold-ups for the developers and also for nature decisions. I think a strong recommendation would be greater resourcing to do fuller recommendations and investigations around offshore wind. That will take some of the burden off the industry doing that, and will also give other interested parties the confidence that it's been done from a third-party point of view and actually funded through the public purse rather than a developer having to pay for that.
Thank you. Just before I move on, can I just pin you down on, it also sounded like you're making a recommendation there for a joined-up approach on species and shared ecosystems.
Absolutely. We have some cross-border sites, for example. In terms of management, they tend to lag behind because there's not always agreement on how best to approach that. There are sites, which I'm sure Gemma can point to, in the offshore area where we don't have the greatest alignment. So the Regulation 35 packages are not always, some of them aren't actually written yet. So we need to have those management recommendations in place. That requires cross-border consideration and join up.
Do you write to the committee to set out the areas where these policies haven't been written yet?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Ms. Goodwin?
I would probably add, from an industry perspective, yeah, it feels like there is a lot of room for better join-up between the devolved nations, mostly in the kind of the consenting side of things. Mm-hmm. And lots of marine projects will span large geographic areas. You might have a wind farm in the Celtic Sea where they're bringing the power ashore, in Wales, and the projects are connected across the different environmental components, sometimes across different devolved nations. And so if we want to be delivering these large-scale infrastructure projects at pace, the more consistency we have in approach, the better. So I think, from a governance perspective, it would be better for industry, it would be better for the environment if we had a better join-up between the devolved nations.
And could I just add a very quick thing, Mr. Inchcab, that about standards. So JNCC has an important role in working with the 4 countries on establishing common standards. And I referred to the OSPAR principles that underpin the UK Marine Protected Area Network. They have to be agreed. There's some things that just actually have to be agreed across the 4 countries, and they have been. So we'd like to see continuation of cooperation, collaboration to ensure that we are comparing the same things when we are asked about the effectiveness of these measures.
Okay. Thank you very much. That was very clear. Final point then, the MPA network covers 69% of Wales inshore waters. This sits at 51% for England and 22% in Scotland. Would you say that the commitments across the 4 nations are assigned in a fair and equitable way?
Would you like me to start?
Yes.
I think it's different, the approaches. I mean, not to correct your figures, because they're absolutely right. I think the other thing we need to remember is Wales hasn't actually designated any sites in the offshore yet, so there's a job to do there. The site designations have been led by where the features are, but I think when we look at MCZs, the Marine Conservation Zones, the opportunity for socio-economic considerations to be brought into where the site boundaries were finally decided upon was weighted differently in different countries, and that has led to less optimal sites sometimes. Whereas in terms of the habitat regulation sites, special areas of conservation and special protected areas, economic and social interests were put into the management part, so the designation of the site was based on what the features needed to be delivered. So when we got down to marine conservation zones, or NCMPs as they are in Scotland, the variances began to come through because they were underpinned by slightly different legislation. I think the other thing we need to remember is, of course, I've lost my train of thought. Pass over you, Gemma. You might come back to me.
Yes. So, what does it mean to be equitable is dependent on the environmental outcome. In this case, on the environmental outcomes we are looking for. So, at that point about, do you necessarily need to see 30% in each place? Probably not. The UK has committed to 30% of UK waters. The reason environmental policy is devolved is because it has to be responsive to that location, that geographical area. So I think that's probably less of an issue that or JNCC is concerned about. It's more of the areas that are designated. Are they being managed effectively? Are they being monitored effectively? So that we know what works. And at the moment, in the offshore, we are monitoring 1 site per year of 78.
Any further comments?
I remember one point. In terms of the equitability, I think the part of the main issue we have in terms of management is that the funding for the statutory bodies is driven by central government process around the various conventions. That doesn't map directly with the area that you need to manage. So Wales, large inshore area covered, its budget is set centrally by government. What we actually need is a greater distribution of wealth around what needs to be managed, rather than does that come from your designated government's budget. There should be a central budget to cover that, and I think that would actually help JNCC manage more than 1 site a year in the offshore.
Sounds like a very good recommendation.
Survey
as
one
well.
site.
Sorry, yes, survey.
So we don't need to survey all of them.
No.
You know, the very well established sampling techniques. There will be sentinel sites that help us understand what's happening in the wider ecosystem. But we're not, and there are multiple ways in which you can generate good evidence using expert judgment and proxies. But in terms of what's actually happening in those environments, there's good technological innovation, and undoubtedly AI can help, but all of that is in its infancy. It needs testing. We need to make sure that we move forward understanding what's there and what isn't there, using whichever methodology is most appropriate for the question.
Very much. Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Chair. And firstly, a question to Mr. Cunningham, if that's okay. There is a vigorous campaign at present for the banning of bottom trawling in UK marine protected areas, on the basis that there's a pretty good evidence that this type of fishing is environmentally damaging. I wonder if you could just explain to us what sort of damage this practice does to the marine environment.
Yeah, so this is primarily, just to be fully clear, I think there are different views across the NGOs of where that is necessary and where it's a mixed reviews. I can come back to that happily. In terms of damage, benthic toad is generally talking about autotrolls and other benthic toad, so large, heavy, either bags or pieces of wood dragged behind, which rake through the seabed and in turn scare up the fish, or in some cases scallops, and catch that. Obviously, dragging a heavy thing across the seabed causes damage in an area that might have been designated for a benthic feature. I say might have been, because not all sites are designated for the same reasons. That can cause damage directly to the features the site is meant to be protecting, and that is where it's a very good question. Is that really compatible with the purpose of the site?
Okay. Why do you? So you kind of say there's a mixed view about why the activity is still allowed within the UK MPAs. Can you kind of explore that a bit more for me?
Absolutely. I think the first thing we need to know is the fishermen are not acting illegally. It's currently it's perfectly legal. It's not compatible with what the site is designated for. We had a review of the offshore English benthic MPAs. Stage 1 and Stage 2 were undertaken, Stage 3 and Stage 4 were consulted upon, but the recommendations have not been progressed. And that simply means of the 23 sites that were consulted upon, so far only 4 have new management measures, so 19 are lacking any change in management there. The other side of this we need to think about is what happens to that fishing pressure. Removing it from a protected area does not remove it from the sea. So that's creating competition between the industries, but it also means they're being pushed into areas where they may not have fished previously, or into areas where it may not be suitable, for example, into an area where there may be subsea cables. So we need to have an actual conversation about how much fishing effort is enough from an ecological point of view and how much is enough from an economic point of view. Just to touch on the inshore approach, because I think there does need to be a difference between that. There's a very good example from the Sussex IFCA where they actually took a bylaw review of their entire region, including their MPAs and also the areas outside of it, and looked at what was the ecological need of that area, and then consulted with the industry to restrict through bylaws bottom towed gear where it was necessary. So that wasn't just bound by MCZ boundaries, it was actually looking at what nature needed. And that's led to a very positive outcome. That's one of 10 IFCAs that's taken that approach. So we need to see a similar consultation elsewhere.
That's an interesting example, and you've kind of hinted at this, but what would be the immediate kind of environmental impact of a complete ban?
The immediate one would be removing that pressure. It takes a long time for these seabed habitats to recover. Many of them will take 50 years, so that the immediate effect is not straightforward. However, I would say if we're looking at this from a net zero point of view, we do need to remember the sea is our biggest carbon sink. Every time you impact that, you release carbon dioxide, and that's going to undermine our net zero ambitions. So the immediate impact would be helping deliver towards net zero.
Okay. I'm just going back to an answer that you made earlier. You mentioned the need to kind of raise the levels of all our marine areas. And I just wondered what your view was on the government's recently announced change in view on disposal of unexploded ordnance or sea blasts. Do you think that's a good example of actions government can take to not only support protected areas but organisms across boundaries?
I will have to draw a blank on that because at the moment I can't remember what the announcement was around.
It is. Jones Sea played a role coordinating the 4 countries. It's a really good example where you need a common understanding and common standard associated with noise thresholds. So yes, it is a good requirement and a good set of evidence-informed and agreed across the 4 nations. So that takes a huge amount of effort and time, but it is well worth it. And it's about giving clarity to the industry and signalling what's acceptable, what's not acceptable for environmental recovery.
And Mr. Godwin, do you feel that that example has really helped industry to kind of know what's coming down the track?
I think whenever we get strong, clear messages from government, it helps industry because, as Gemma's pointed out, certainty and clarity is one of the things that industry likes most. I think on that particular example, lots of the conclusions of the work pointed towards best practice within industry that often was already happening. I think there were some advances made as well, but yeah, so I think it's welcome. I think there's, yeah.
May I add something, just very quickly, that there is a global analysis that we could provide you with about how seabed habitats recover if you ban bottom trawling.
That would be really helpful for the...
If I just may add one thing, just transition is a key point here. We've got to make sure that we support the industry move away from the current practices. We had 100 million from the Seafood Improvement Programme in 2019 for all 4 nations. That is an extremely small amount of money to support what could be an extremely responsible and sustainable business, aquaculture as well as fisheries. If you compare that with the amount of money we put into supporting farmers be more ecologically friendly last year, that was to the tune of 2-point-something billion. There's obviously a disparity there. There's an opportunity for the UK, if we're looking at areas of growth, to really invest in responsible and sustainable aquaculture in particular, and give an opportunity for the industry to reskill, retrain and be future-proofed.
A very good point made, and kind of links to my next question, which is whether the economic, social, environmental and scientific demands on the marine environment are adequately balanced in the context of marine spatial planning, and that's obviously a context to it, isn't it? So do you think that the current system has the correct balance? And I'll start with Ms. Godwin, if that's okay, and move across.
To an extent, yes, but again, I think we can go further. I think that there's different things that we're balancing. So we're balancing the environment, the natural environment itself, the habitat and the species, and human pressures. But then there's also the balancing act between the different types of human pressures. And I think that juggling all of those different things at the moment is a bit colloquial, but it's a bit haphazard. We don't have a clear vision about what should take priority or what the direction for the UK should be. So we kind of operate with a first come, first served basis at the moment. So I think to an extent, when an individual decision is being made about a project, you are weighing up all of those different considerations, and the regulations we have are really strong and robust and good, but they fail to take into account that broader strategic approach that we need. And it comes back to my point that we need this holistic planning for the marine space. We need an updated UK marine policy statement, and we need to build in this evidence base that's been collected through the Marine Delivery Route Map and the whole of Seabed, and we need that connection to what's going on terrestrially and what's happening in the marine. And I think we've touched about a lot of the failings in our marine protected areas, but one of the kind of the big gaps is looking at those global pressures. So, climate change, ocean acidification, what's coming down from our rivers. I think if you look at how different marine industries are regulated and the impacts that they're having on the marine protected sites, I think it's a fair and just process. And quite rightly, industry are questioned about the impacts they're having, and then they have to appropriately mitigate and compensate for those impacts. But it's not all within the gift of one developer or one project to solve climate change or address ocean temperatures rising or think about what nutrients are coming down the river. So I think we've got this bigger global problem, and we need to have a strategic way of dealing with that. And Barry Gardner, you mentioned biodiversity net gain. We're working, or the UK government is working on marine net gain, and again, industry is really supportive of having a policy on marine net gain, and we're working closely with the UK government to try and bring that forward, but we need to bring it forward quickly. So I think there's a lot of potential, there's lots of good things happening, but it all needs to be joined up with this clear vision of where we're heading in the UK, and I don't think we have that joined up at the moment.
Just follow up on that. Is there any kind of industries that you feel kind of aren't fully involved in the discussions covering marine spatial planning? I'm kind of thinking about recreational organisations, perhaps.
I think that the MMO are very good at engaging all of the different marine industries, and they know who the different industries are. But one of the problems that we have at the moment is other policy areas are moving faster. So, for example, DESNES are working on the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan, which has marine components. I don't think all marine industries are plugged into those conversations, yet that's moving very quickly. And if we have a Strategic Spatial Energy Plan that points to parts of the sea that have to be used in a certain way, yet we don't have a marine plan coming forward to meet it, then it means that if, whoever goes first, whoever shoots first, decides what happens. So
do you think there needs to be more joining up between different plans, basically, within government?
Absolutely, and I think I was looking at the kind of the foundations for the Environment Audit Committee, and I think one of the things that I read was that you look across the different government departments and try and see where the join-up is on environmental issues. And I think from my perspective and the different processes I'm involved in, we could do a lot better on joining up. There are so many government departments that have an influence on how we use our sea. We have a digital strategy that influences how our telecoms cables are laid. We have department the DFT, Department for Transport, they're influencing how ports are evolving or developing policy for ports. We have DESNES, so that's carbon capture, that's oil and gas, and that's offshore wind, but there's silos within those departments. And then, of course, we have DEFRA, who have the responsibility for managing the marine environment. And then there's the MOD. So there's so many different activities going on, different areas of policy being developed. And I think we could definitely do better in joining them up.
That's very, very helpful. Do either of the other witnesses like to comment on that?
Thank you, yes. I mean, I think it's the question of balance is an interesting framing in the context of globally at least 1 million species at risk of extinction, and we are on track to breach the Paris Agreement this decade. So I don't think balance adequately describes the action that needs to be taken as society to deal with those challenges. And referring to the Gardner referred to Das Scripture, it's very clear that economy is within nature. So the resilience and health of marine natural systems, of all natural systems, are beneficial for our economies and for our societies. And I think the question then is, to what extent are we willing to invest? Do we understand which ecosystems have most impact, which pressures have most cumulative impact, and how are we going to prioritise through spatial planning to ensure that we get resilient ecosystem services that enable economic growth and societal prosperity through whichever industries, from recreation to fisheries to cables, oil and gas, renewables. And so I think there's a slight reframing to be done there. I also think that it absolutely needs to be cross-sectoral, so working together, not just the 4 nations working together, but each of the sectors working together, using the best available evidence to be much more prescriptive in the marine plans. There's a huge amount of work that's gone into marine plans, and it's a very good inventory of all the various policies and all the various activities that are taking place in any given spatial area. What it doesn't tell you is what's right in terms of the outcome that you want to achieve. And we do have a vision for the UK marine environment to be, and I'm hoping I can remember, clean, healthy, safe, but I was getting there, productive and biologically diverse. Right? So that is a well-established vision. It's quite long, that's why no one can remember it. But the point about it is it's got to be adaptive to changing climate, to climate breakdown. Everything is going to change. We need to be ready to adapt to it. We need to invest in our marine and our terrestrial natural systems in a way that builds their resilience to help us adapt to climate change. A much more adaptive approach that draws on the best scientific evidence, that's cross-sectoral, and is courageous about the things we need to do, is what I would argue is needed.
I absolutely agree. I think just to really pick up a key point there, we need to stop just looking at the environment from a protectionist point of view and look at investing in it because it can actually deliver a great deal for the economy and for people as well. But I think Gemma summed it up far better than I did.
May I add just one quick more?
Oh, let me just bring Barry Gardner in, and if your question hasn't been asked, then...
Very, very quick points. The MMO, the Marine Management Organisation, was supposed to be completing stage 3 and 4 of the review on destructive activities, namely bottom trawling and dredging, as we were talking, that was supposed to come in when? It should have been done by?
Should it just in the previous government?
Yes.
Yes. So I think the deadline was around 2020 was the ambition. No, sorry, 2024 was the ambition to manage that.
Yeah. The stage 3 and 4 should have been done by the end of last year, should it not? So have we any update on when we're expecting that?
No.
In that case, would that be a recommendation that you'd like to see this committee make, that they get on with the job? Yes. And the second is, you talked about the extent of time that it took for areas to recover once they had ceased destructive activity like bottom trawling. Can you recall how long it took for Lyme Bay to recover?
No.
Years.
Yeah. I think technically it would still be in recovery.
Yes, but there has been a marked improvement in a period as small as 5 years, has there not?
And it varies vastly by species. Some
indeed,
will recover quicker than others.
Such that the local fishermen have been amazed at just how quickly it has recovered. So I just wanted to sort of push back gently against this idea that, oh, well, you won't see anything for 50 years. Yeah.
I was thinking in the context of the full ecosystem recovery, it will take a long time. Individual species, absolutely much quicker, depending on the species.
Thank you. Dr. Harper, was there a final point you wanted to make there?
Just on the point about uncertainty and also kind of related to the precautionary principle. So there is a lot of uncertainty in the science. Of course there is. That is the job of science, is to in a sense, reduce that uncertainty. But the more we're finding out, the more uncertainty there is in the system, because we are understanding about how everything is connected to everything else. And if we do think of natural systems as national infrastructure, then the model we might want to look at is, well, how do we deal with that in health? How do we deal with that in aviation? How do we deal with that in nuclear industry? Uncertainty doesn't stop us doing things. Uncertainty and a precautionary principle would say that actually we need to take a view that the resilience of these systems is more important than not taking action because we are uncertain about the science.
Final question, Olivia Blake.
I was just going to ask quickly about workforce, given you have been explaining this as infrastructure. Do you think that we understand the necessary workforce that's needed to improve monitoring and maintenance of these areas? Or do you think that's a question for another day?
Well,
I think we understand the requirements, and this is where it comes back to cross-government. We're not setting ourselves up to do that, so it needs to actually go down to GCSEs, A-levels, university options.
Okay.
When we look at, let's say, steel, we have a mandate for a number of welders, and that then filters down to colleges. How many courses can we deliver? We are not doing that for our other marine industries, whether that be monitoring, surveying, oceanographers or marine planners. We really need to think about how do we link the education system and the career prospects to the vision we want to see.
yeah.
Thank you, that's useful.
I completely agree with that. And I would just add, I'm a social scientist, so we need a much more interdisciplinary approach to this, and an approach which isn't linear, that you have all the different sciences around the table helping to articulate the problem together. That's how you'll get just transition. And I'm sure you'll hear from the eminent academics you have in the second panel that there is an ecological skills supply shortage in this country, and that needs investment into.
Thank you very much.
And I can add that industry have that same issue. The same, the ecologists that start their career in, Natural England or JNCC might move on to a consultancy or a developer, and there's constant shortage of skills. And I think industry are also taking steps to try and go back to the root and make people aware of the fact that there are fantastic careers that you can have in the marine.
Thank you very much. One day we'll have a panel here who say we've got plenty of people in our area of work, but that happy day is not today. Thank you so much, Members Godwin, Dr. Harper, Mr. Cunningham, for your evidence. We'll bring this first panel to a close. This sitting is suspended. One. Order. Well, welcome to the second panel of today's Environmental Audit Committee. Delighted to be joined by our panellists, Professor Austen and Professor Koldewey. Can I ask you to introduce yourselves and your area of interest in this whole subject, please?
Okay, so I'm Mel Austen. I'm Professor of Ocean and Society at the University of Plymouth. I'm also, for the record, also on the board of Natural England, the committee of JNCC. I chair the partnership of the UNESCO Biosphere Reserve in North Devon. I've just joined the trustees of the British Ecological Society. And also, I'm the director of the Centre for Doctoral Training for Sustainable Management of Marine Resources. And I bring that in just because we were talking about, are we training the people for the future? And we've just started training 44 PhD students. There's a desperate need for more of them, and we would love the government to recommend a need for more expertise in this area.
Excellent, thank you. That's been heard. Professor Koldewey.
Hello, Heather Koldewey. I lead the Bertarelli Foundation's Marine Science Programme. I'm based at and employed by the Zoological Society of London. I'm also an honorary professor at the University of Exeter Penryn campus. I live in a coastal community in West Cornwall with a marine conservation zone on the doorstep. Trustee of the Marine Biological Association, Surface Against Sewage, and a small social enterprise called Coast 4C. My expertise is primarily, I have to say, in the UK overseas territories.
Excellent. Well, thank you both. Firstly, to start with you, if I may, Professor Koldewey. In your view, what are the priority areas in terms of ecosystems for effective restoration of the UK's marine environment to meet the coming Montreal 30 by 30 commitment?
Well, I think in terms of priority areas, there's two ways of looking at it. Firstly is protecting what we've got, and then the second is restoring what has been depleted and destroyed over time. And obviously in the context of climate change, we need to think about those habitats that are particularly important in the context of carbon storage. So that's things like salt marshes, seagrass, mangroves, and also the deep sea environment, which we're learning more and more about its importance in terms of carbon storage. I think all habitats are important, and in the context of the UK overseas territories, we obviously that's been a huge contribution of the UK government to biodiversity conservation on a massive scale of 4.4 million square kilometres, including some of the best coral reefs in the Indian Ocean region, etc. So the importance there is how we ensure that protection is effective and that we think at an ecosystem scale. So we've already heard that many systems are connected, so one species may be born in one area, move to another, feed in another, and so on. And so it's not as not always as simple as thinking about one habitat, and that's why I think the point raised about protected areas looking at ecosystems rather than just specific things or features is so critical.
Yep, thank you. Professor Austen, on that same question, what do you see as the priority areas in regard to 30 by 30?
I tend to view this through a sort of systems thinking lens of natural capital and ecosystem services. So I tend to think about what are the habitats that provide most of those ecosystem services, which is the underpinning biodiversity that delivers those. And one habitat that I think we give poor shrift to is offshore sediments, offshore coastal deep sea sediments. Going to an earlier question, what happens when you trawl the seabed? The seabed is a three-dimensional structure full of little wriggly things that bring nutrients down from the overlying water, turn them around, store some of them, turn them back up again. It's a really, really dynamic, busy system in its best pristine state. And, we have organisms that go down to a metre, that have big burrows, they're very complicated, huge microbial fauna around them, doing stuff that supports the whole fish, cetaceans, whales, dolphins, everything above. So we don't tend to think about it in terms of that. So we're protecting for the features. You know, there might be a sea pen or something that people see as a significant thing. But I actually just think that whole system, that whole structure of sediment is one of those things that we need to think about. I think it goes back to your whole system thinking. We need to think about these as a whole system that needs protecting and not just bits of it. And we need to think about the ones that might be important. And as has been mentioned before, it's a huge blue carbon repository as well. So rather than taking things piecemeal, we just need to think a little bit more big about what we do. I still think that's compatible, though, with the sectoral use as well.
Yes, and I mean, we heard in the last session the suggestion that, you know, the UK government in some ways was world leading in terms of its commitment to marine protected areas, but that actually, you know, the bigger questions were not about the number of designations, but about the quality of implementation within those designated areas. I mean, do you think that the UK government's current approach is adequate to support restoration of the marine environment to meet those 30 by 30 commitments, Professor Austen?
I think all of us would have liked to have seen something that happened a lot more rapidly beyond, you know, there was designation, and then it's taken a long time to get to what does designation mean, what do we actually manage and how do we manage it. I mean, we are making a lot of progress. I think somebody mentioned precautionary principle earlier, and I think we probably could have employed that a lot sooner and then said, okay, for an adaptive management, have we been over the top? Can we now maybe step back and say, yeah, well, actually, maybe other things can happen. Maybe we can do things. Reducing pressures is the key thing. If we want nature recovery, particularly in the offshore areas, there's not a lot we can do about sort of implementing seagrass planting or salt marsh restoration type activities offshore. It's just too difficult. So the only thing we can really do is take some of those pressures away. And I think we've probably been slow to take the pressures away and slow to think about what is it we actually want from those bits of marine environment that are protected as well as those that aren't.
And would you have any sense as to whether that's changed, that sort of slightly, that criticism has changed under the new government, or have things broadly continued business as usual over the last sort of 6 or 7 months?
I'm not sure I really know the answer to that question.
Okay, well, I wouldn't want you to guess then. And in turning now, Professor Koldewey, to the same question, but in the context of the overseas territories, to what extent do you think that the current approach is adequate in terms of delivery and implementation there?
Well, I think the UK government has had a world-leading role in the context of the UK overseas territories, and that's obviously delivering a huge amount in the context of international commitments. The key is that's been really dependent on Blue Belt and Darwin Plus funding, which has stayed static and is probably delivering some of the best conservation outcomes for the best value for money. I think it works out at about £2 per square kilometre of ocean protected. So the key thing there is sustaining and increasing with inflationary levels that level of funding to support those locations that have started off the Chagos Archipelago being the largest marine protected area in the world for some time, a competition that I think is good to lose, with other bigger ones. But I think the change and the opportunity for the new government is thinking about the community role, which has been a shift from perhaps more top-down to bottom-up approaches, and we're really seeing remarkable leadership from within those UK overseas territories who've identified their priorities based on their place, their culture, and what's appropriate. There's also a lot to learn in a domestic context, which I have to say I found unbelievably complicated. And I think if you look at the recent reports on how 30 by 30 is going generally for marine protection, any protected areas that still, so we know highly protected marine areas work. There's hundreds of scientific papers that show that. We don't need to keep proving that in every single site. That's bad use of science resource. We know that. We have plenty of evidence. We need to then look at that high protection to be happening here in our domestic waters.
Yeah.
We need to dramatically simplify how we go about managing to achieve those targets. And as we heard earlier, you know, in the course of my lifetime, we've lost nearly 3/4 of wildlife. That's ZSL and WWF's Living Planet Index. You know, just in a couple of years, that's another 4%. It's gone just in 2 years. So I think action, slowing down, you know, precautionary principles, keeping moving, and you know, that's a worry if you say it's in 6 months, that's still a significant opportunity to lose more. And in all we're seeing and experiencing on a weekly basis in terms of climate-driven disasters and biodiversity loss and failing to meet every international target, we don't really have the time to sort of think. We have the scientific evidence, we just need to act on it.
Yeah. And going back to what you were saying at the start there about, you know, the effectiveness of the UK government in terms of the overseas territories. Obviously a recent area of consideration, concern has been around the Chagos Islands, obviously incredibly important in terms of their marine diversity. Is this something that causes you real concern at all?
The biggest...
the possibility of Britain no longer, you know, Britain, the status of the Chagos Islands changing?
So obviously, you know, most marine protected areas and thinking about protecting marine biodiversity are worried about political change within government. So to go through sovereignty changes, obviously, it would be the first chance. However, we've worked very closely at ZSL and with other organisations with the Mauritian government. Environment is important to everybody. Meeting those targets is important to every country. And looking at retaining that ambition, it would be a new marine protected area, of course, under Mauritian sovereignty, but with the data and evidence and the opportunity to finance that based on nature versus exploitation, I think there's encouraging opportunities for that. Obviously, nothing's certain, and the biggest concern I have at the moment is that the environment is dropping down the agenda of discussion. Obviously, security and other issues are incredibly important in that area, but it's the most important site in the Indian Ocean. It provides fish and coral larvae to the whole of East Africa and to Indonesia, north to the Maldives. There's a bunch of superlatives. I can say it's one of the most important ocean areas on the planet. So that is what needs to go through any new arrangement and new treaty. And that also applies if things don't change. I mean, I can't emphasise the importance enough of that location, backed up by about 200 scientific papers that say the same.
Thank you very much. Chris Hinchliffe.
Thank you, Chair. There are many legitimate and competing demands on the marine environment which are only likely to increase. And given some of your comments so far, I can't resist asking, in the context of the high-profile debate around growth that we have at the moment, your thoughts on whether year-on-year increases in the exploitation of marine resources can be sustainable in the context of our environmental commitments.
Yeah. Okay. I'm so glad you asked that question because I hadn't really talked about other effective conservation measures, and I do think the growth agenda can go quite firmly hand in hand with a nature positive agenda. And I think, Gemma was also saying the same thing earlier. We can build offshore renewable farms that are nature positive, that have nature features. I think one thing I've begun to learn is that if we look on land, many of our terrestrial systems that we want to protect are actually quite artificial. They've arrived there through controlled grazing or through controlled whatever. We know that if we put structures in the marine environment, we get different biodiversity, we get growth in biodiversity. Depending on the structures, we can get strange biodiversity. We lose some of the footprint of the original biodiversity, for sure, but we can actually get, particularly thinking through the ecosystem services lens, we can actually get something that can be quite positive. So I'm actually kind of quite with the idea that we can do nature positive growth, but I think we just need to think about what do we want from that nature, what do we want from the growth, again, it goes back to the previous speakers about we need an updated policy statement or some sort of idea of what it is we actually want from the marine environment. And that will mean taking some, again, to paraphrase, to repeat, some courageous decisions about what are the industries, what are the sectors that we actually need going forward, looking ahead and saying we might not need them right now, but we might need them in 20 years' time, 25 years' time. Actually taking that long-term vision about what's required from our marine environment and how to plan for it now. So I don't even think it's just marine spatial prioritisation. I think it's about building in positive nature in everything we do in the marine environment from now, whether it be marine protected areas or outside of marine protected areas, but trying to think about what's the vision that we want to do and where do we want to get that growth, but where do we also want the nature growth and the low carbon, the zero carbon areas. So yeah, I'm a bit more positive about that.
Koldewey?
I think some of that comes down, I mean, all industries are not the same, right? And all economic growth is not the same. And I think some of the opportunities are anchored in local communities, and perhaps that hasn't been discussed enough today, is that, and coming from a small coastal community, coastal communities are the poorest communities in the UK. So I think looking at how there is sustainable blue natural capital development and blue economy is a jargony term that lends itself beautifully to green/blue wash, but there are great opportunities, and the important part of that is the communities being part of those decisions and part of that decision making, and understanding what's happening in their waters. So that leads to sort of building those opportunities. We've heard examples from Lyme Bay, Arran, where there is hand-in-hand opportunities for coastal regeneration, replenishment of marine-based activities, hand-in-hand with the nature-based approaches led by communities, including fishers. So that's what we need to learn from. There's plenty of global examples of how we go about that.
There, very briefly to say, I'd be really welcome if you could write to the committee setting out what some of those community-led examples might be. But perhaps to move on to specifics around management, thinking about the different industries that use the marine environment and marine resources, how effective do you feel the current cross-sector approaches to management of the marine environment are?
Well, again, I think they were articulated quite well previously, that there's a bit of a mismatch of who's doing what where and who's overseeing what where and who's deciding what's going to go where. It did bring back to my mind some discussions that I've had often with people about why don't we have a cross-departmental marine minister who actually could look across the landscape, across the different places, and actually be the kind of what is the perspective of decisions that are made in DESNES or decisions that are made in public health or in the health department concerning the marine environment, and how do these work? I've seen it in Singapore, and to have Environment and Human Health Minister, and I thought, wow, that's a really amazing thing to do, somebody who goes across those departments. So I think that proliferation of legislation and policy and different licensings and people doing things at different paces makes it very difficult to work out how to, for anybody who's trying to operate in that environment, to work out what they can do, what they can't do, slows the pace of development and impedes the pace of sort of thinking about what can we actually do that's a good thing, rather than just how on earth do we get this wind farm in the water, or where are we going to land our fish next, or whatever. I think it's difficult out there for those who are operating, I feel.
That's all the way. I welcome your comments on that, but specifically given some of the comments you just made about communities, obviously management of environmentally protected areas can often conflict with commercial activities on which local communities rely. Are there any particularly effective methods that you would like to make the committee aware of around securing buy-in from local communities in the development specifically of MPAs?
I think social science came up earlier, but I think the local communities and the resource users are usually the knowledge holders too, and I think we've often ignored local knowledge, local ecological knowledge, and not factored that in, so perhaps looked at more university-based science as the sort of gold standard science. And actually, if anyone has spent any time talking to anybody who fishes or is passionate about the ocean, they can tell you all the spots because they're there all day, every day, 365 days a year. So it's different to a scientist who visits a couple of times a year. Different kind of data. We need to merge those two together to really understand and look at how we co-develop solutions. So there are a number of sort of tools. There's one that I know Marine Conservation Societies use very effectively called the Community Voices Method, which is a way of getting over committee meetings where some people will speak and some people won't. That doesn't represent all the opinions and voices in a community. And overall it is about how we listen and learn and are inclusive of different perspectives and reach consensus about what's possible and what's not. But obviously any fisherman or fisherwoman is going to be looking to have fish in the environment for the long term. I mean, it doesn't make any sense otherwise. But obviously a lot of the complexities around regulation and change, climate change, regulatory change, an inherently uncertain business makes for a very difficult operating environment, and we need to be thoughtful and sensitive to that and actually listen and look at how they're part of the decision-making process, not just consulted, tick box, move on, and then somebody else decides, and then they have to change their entire lifestyle as part of that.
Thank you.
I would really reinforce that kind of interdisciplinary approach of people who get the deep science and the ecology, but those who've got that local knowledge. We've used it in the Marine Pioneer that introduced natural capital thinking into the coastal waters, and one of the sites was North Devon. We produced a natural capital plan in connection and in combination, co-designed with the local community. We do it within the UNESCO Biosphere Partnership. There are quite a lot of those community groups, and organisations like the MMO are increasingly plugged in and aware of it. It's just they don't necessarily have the resources to fully engage in that really strongly participatory way that is required.
Thank you very much. So you've quite strongly preempted my next question and possibly covered it to some extent, really, which was all about how the government can ensure that all industries which use marine resources are environmentally sustainable in the long term, and how they can work together to come to that sustainable situation. You've just talked about some interesting case studies there of how that's being delivered in particular locations. You've mentioned resourcing is a challenge in that. I mean, how can the government make more use of those sort of practices? What more can we recommend to the government to do?
I think, again, it came back to your earlier question about workforce, that you need people to work. If you're going to work with communities, it's actually quite time-consuming, and you need people with the right expertise to talk to people, to elicit information, to elicit understanding, to get people's trust, to get their buy-in, their trust, their enthusiasm, particularly in the local kind of community sort of setting. But that also has to be juxtaposed with the people who are maybe trying to sort of get sort of large-scale implementation, large-scale decision-making going. You need quite good negotiating skills to be able to bring those together. And I've certainly seen it in Natural England in the land side of things. I think we tend to be quite under-resourced in doing that, sort of bringing community groups together in the marine sector, from my experience.
Yeah, I guess I'd add 2 points. One is on transparency. So I think the ocean is the biggest common resource, and yet a lot of things that go on is not transparent. So technology and tools that are emerging, satellite surveillance and other remote sensing techniques are helping us be able to see what's going on and how to look at managing that. That's particularly important in the UK overseas territories, which tend to be small island populations with large ocean bodies, and so understanding what's happening in their waters and how to manage and enforce illegal activity is particularly significant. The other thing is we've touched on it indirectly, but the connectivity. So, the biodiversity loss and climate change are inherently interlinked, but tend to operate in different policy frameworks and different committees. The impact that's again come up of sewage pollution and other pollutants and noise pollution sewage coming into our ocean environment is, that land, sea, land, river, freshwater, estuarine is all completely interconnected. You could have the best managed marine protected area and there's regular sewage outfalls and there's nothing you can do about that. So I think thinking about how not just the complexity of the regulatory agencies, but how these issues connect, because they are fundamentally interlinked, is really important.
And I'd actually add the farming sector to that. So it's not just sewage that comes down; it's sediment and nutrients, excess nutrient loading as well.
Yeah. A final question, just to pursue that a little further, then, because we've talked at quite broad, high level there. Do you have any specific recommendations for how the government can integrate that community-led approach with the policy setting that we currently have for managing the marine environment space?
I think people are trying to do that in the marine planning context. There's almost over-consultation, so there's quite a lot of kind of like, please will you respond to a consultation. It is just finding that time and that resource and being able to actually get the engagement on a sort of face-to-face basis that takes resource, it takes time. I think that's the biggest thing is lack of resource, potentially also lack of, and I would say this, but a lack of training of being able to kind of look at that bigger picture stuff and be able to talk to, from one end, a coastal community, somebody whose stake in the marine environment is that they go swimming every day or they go fishing, to another one whose stake in the marine environment is that they're trying to work out where their cabling is going to come ashore and how they're actually going to get the energy that they're producing a long way offshore, into the land, and thinking about those different sectors of communities and those different stakeholders. That requires a lot of skill. There certainly is a lot of that in government that I've seen. I mean, I hats off to some of the people I do see, but you probably need an awful lot more of them.
Yeah, I'd reinforce that it's absolutely critical to get that right from the outset, as running consultations well with the appropriate expertise, which usually comes from the social science sector, and also looking at. There are very well established approaches, but many people working in those in government or who are doing those consultations might have backgrounds like me in biology of a fish, So that's not necessary. That's an important skill set, but you have to work alongside those with the expertise to know how to not only talk to communities but listen to communities, make them feel part of the decision making. And while that is resource intensive up front, we're still dealing with the consequences and negative perception of marine protection in the UK because of poor consultation processes over a decade ago. That's lived really long in the minds of people that didn't feel part of it, didn't understand it, felt decisions were made outside of their control and are having to live with the consequences. So front-loading that investment gives you much better chance of people feeling they've co-developed, co-created, and that leads to a much more sustainable long-term approach. And that there are successful examples in Wales, in the southwest and elsewhere, that and mentioned examples in Scotland. So there's some good diverse cases, as well as internationally, where talking to colleagues in the Philippines who are super proud of their marine protected areas that are led by communities and find it bewildering how we've ended up in a slightly messy situation here.
There is an issue of empowerment. Yeah. I mean, we talk about community engagement or stakeholder engagement. We have a seabed that is owned by the Crown Estate, who lease it for an income, or a revenue rather. We have a government that manages the activities in that area, that does it in a piecemeal way. And it's quite difficult for anybody to feel very empowered or involved or engaged in a system that is as complex as that. I look at what goes on land and national nature reserves. It's a combination of people who want to do the right thing, maybe the NGOs, farmers who want to get a different revenue stream. But the good news is that they can buy the land and decide what they're going to do with it and do it within a government remit. But in the marine environment, it's kind of hard for anybody to kind of get the grip of the system of how would you actually make that marine protection, that marine environmental improvement work within the constraints of nobody's really fully empowered to actually engage in doing something positive.
Thank you very much.
Barry Gardner.
Thank you, Chair. I like that last analogy that you used in terms of farming and soil structure and what you said about the whole sedimentary ecosystem. Has any work been done on trying to calculate the value, the natural capital value of that sedimentary system that you were talking about? Because in your earlier remarks you said, well, it's about a metre where a heck of a lot of things is going on. It's not just about carbon sequestration, although that obviously has a value as well, but it's also supportive of the whole of the rest of the oceanic biodiversity. So if that could be put into a figure, valorized, or whatever the word is, has that work been done? Has that data...
So it has for blue carbon. It's astonishingly difficult to do it for all of the ecosystem services, so we do sort of try. I think we've kind of got to the point where actually monetizing these sort of services with the uncertainties that are involved starts to feel a little bit ridiculous. On the other hand, I slightly tongue-in-cheek think that some of what we do with GDP is also slightly ridiculous. So if we do it there, why don't we do it there? I think we can do that sort of back of an envelope. This is what we think, if we add this all up, we can do it. Most scientists are very nervous and not really very comfortable about doing that, or most socio-ecologists, socio-economists, economists, socio-ecologists. Anyway, the interdisciplinary ones amongst us are not really very comfortable about trying to do that monetization because it has such huge uncertainties on it. Not least of which is actually understanding exactly the quantified, just how much function do you need to get this much ecosystem service. Those are the sort of scientific uncertainties we do still have.
I suppose what I'm trying to get from you is some sort of feel, because you talked about the Crown Estates, and they're trying to balance these very complex choices, really. And there's, on the one side, clear economic metrics, and on the other side, what you're telling us, is there are very uncertain biological metrics. But they have huge monetary implications. It's very difficult to quantify them. So if you were the Crown Estates, you'd be weighing up something which has a clear metric on one side with something that doesn't have a clear metric on the other. How do you go about doing that?
You can do it, but there are a lot of, as I say, uncertainties, and they probably would struggle to find a bona fide or economist who'd be terrifically happy to do it. I actually start to think that, well, no, I don't start to think, I think some of this is in the realms of scientists can say this stuff is really important, these things happen, we can quantify them to a certain extent, but we've already signed up to Cunningham, the GBIF, we've already signed up to zero carbon. We haven't done that on the basis of here's the monetary reason why we should do it. We just think actually it's important enough.
What we haven't
a political decision
is what protection means.
Yeah.
Difficulty there. We signed up that we're going to protect 30%, But as we were hearing the earlier panel, what that actually means in practice is pretty vacuous, or pretty not vacuous, but it's not clear exactly what level of protection is being put in place. Let me. I wanted to talk to you about baselines, and you know, we've all heard the analogy of when we used to clean the front of the car, and you know, I used to do it with my mum. She would pay me £0.50. Sorry, it's that old. to clean the car, and I would leave a patch at the front which was covered in to show her what a great job I'd done. It's very difficult to do that in the marine environment. But 15 years ago, Callum Roberts and his team did some analysis by looking at the data back from 1892 and showing that we were, for our input power, I think, in terms of the fishing capacity that we now had, we were getting 17 times less, or 17 times fewer fish out, and that fish. What is the difficulty with baselines? How do we need to overcome that difficulty in our enforcement and operation of spatial planning?
One of the difficulties in baselines is that they shift. So what might have happened, probably we'd need to go back to the Industrial Revolution, pre-Industrial Revolution, to know what went on. Unfortunately, we didn't have a whole bunch of Victorians who went around counting and identifying everybody in the everything in the marine environment in the same way as they have on land. So the terrestrial baselines haven't shifted as much. Or at least we have more of an idea of we've got more understanding than we have in marine. So I think there is a real problem. I know I look at the marine environment and I have a different baseline from somewhere else. I'd almost flip it on the other side and say we have climate change, so we don't actually know what some of the outcomes are going to be. And I'll give you an example. I live on the Tamar estuary. About 20 years ago, there was upstream thinking where they started paying farmers, Southwest Water paid farmers, not to put as much fertiliser on their land so that it was cheaper for them to abstract water without having to chemically process it to remove nitrates.
And is the case?
20 years later, there's a seagrass bed intertidally in front of my house. For a long time, it was a dark green mass of nuisance algae, and I kind of went out about 7 years ago to have a look at something, my mooring, I think, and realised that actually this had been transformed into, there was quite a lot of seagrass coming. We've had PhD students looking on it. Now, we don't normally have so much seagrass in the intertidal. We would not expect the species that is in the intertidal to be in the intertidal. It's predominantly a subtidal species, but it's in the intertidal. It's very dense. It grows. It looks like a cricket pitch or a football pitch. It's really dense. And we're all going like, what's this doing here? How did it get here? I think that's another shifting baseline. Now, we could sort of say, well, that's a really good thing, seagrass. What's not to like about seagrass? But we just don't know. I don't know what the ecosystem services are on it. And I think there's going to be more and more of those changes. And I think it's going to be really difficult to predict what's going to happen. So in Lyme Bay, you've talked about that, there has been an increase in biodiversity. There's actually an increase in hard bottom creating shells and shellfish, which none of us would have expected because they weren't there in our lifetimes. They probably were there previously. So, yeah, it's going to be a problem to kind of just sort of say, and particularly to the industry sectors, to say, well, this is what we're expecting, because in many cases we don't quite know what we are expecting, but we usually see an increase in biodiversity. We usually see, so in the seagrass bed, we're not necessarily seeing so far an increase in biodiversity in the sediment. What we are seeing is an increase in biomass and visitation of seabirds and wildfowl. But we haven't got any scientists who actually do bird watching looking at what's going on the seagrass. I can just tell you anecdotally, because I've lived there a long time, that there's a lot more seabirds and they seem to be quite diverse and they're very different to the ones when I first lived there. So that's not quite scientific evidence. It's me as an expert saying something's changed and it's different and it looks good. But I'm not sure we know what the outcomes will be.
There's the lack of good quality data.
Yeah.
And if we're thinking about our management of the seabed today, because of that lack of good quality data, how likely is it that we could be facilitating damage to the ecosystem because we don't have the data to demonstrate it?
So I think that the lack of data is a very good excuse that scientists always look for more data, right? I mean, that it's hard to be put on the spot because you can never say that data are perfect and they change and then there's observations. But we use that as an excuse far too often to say we can't make decisions. I work and have always worked in really data poor situations, and actually the protection of Chagos started in a very data poor situation. It's still very data poor proportionally, but it's much better. But we were still able, by consensus and a precautionary principle, to make good decisions. And there's a lot to be learnt from many other places that we can apply. It's not always exactly the same, but I think we need to actually get over ourselves a bit and move on and actually say, we do know this. So we know almost everywhere trawling is highly destructive and is very bad for biodiversity. So how it happens in marine protected areas is beyond me. Same for dredging. We know it's damaging. There's lots of papers. It's a subsidised fishery. It makes, in a biodiversity conservation context, it makes absolutely no sense at all, and it's backed up by science. What happens outside?
Why has the MMO not yet proceeded to stage 3 and 4?
I don't know, but that's the global view on trawling is that. So I think that we start ending up with what we do know in science, and then we get to a site-specific place, and we say, but we don't know exactly that right here in this place, and that just then holds everything up. And actually, we need to be better at saying, it may be a gap, it may not be perfect, but let's make a decision and move, and then fill those knowledge gaps as we go.
And I think that's where I was going to. Is we don't know quite where the outcome is, but we know that if we reduce or remove the pressures, something will change, and it's not going to be for the worse. I think we're both committed that it's not going to be for the worse if you remove pressures. I think we do know what the pressures are. We know that climate change is a pressure. We know that we've got too much carbon going into the environment. We know that trawl or dredge fishing is a pressure.
So if we turn to the Indian Overseas Territories, the Chagos marine biota, we know that there's going to be pressure on fisheries in that area because
we don't.
Well, the enforcement that we've already had has shown that there is encroachment by fishing.
There's illegal fishing, yeah, and it's affected. It's decreased shark populations and others for sure.
Indeed. Yeah. So under the agreement or the putative agreement, who is going to pay for the enforcement of that in the future to ensure that those pressures don't increase?
As a scientist, I don't have the answer to that question. How many crowns did you earn in your... I think all protected areas need some degree of enforcement as part of the management plan. These large-scale remote ones are particularly tricky. And when they're somewhere like Chagos, that all the science has shown that those decisions to protect it fully at the time were the right decisions, we basically filled in the blanks and gone, yes, it really is globally significant and it's vital to protect it. But pressures change. We know that fuel subsidies and changing fishing in India has affected the poaching. We know the reasons and who poaches and why they poach, and we need to look at what deterrents and mechanisms we need to put in place to do that. That might be bilateral agreements, as the UK has been doing with Sri Lanka and trying to do with India, and so it would become a new government to look at how you manage that. So we have a lot of data to say, this is where the pressure is, and this is how you need to fix it. The choice, then how you do that, we have a whole suite of new technology that can support enforcement. It doesn't solve it. We have the legislation challenges to then prosecute. But I think all these large-scale protected areas are in their infancy. So it's, and each one is different. They have different characteristics. So there is a global community working together to learn from that. Same for Pitcairn, same for Ascension, same for...
Let me ask this question to get us back more specific. And final question, I promised you. How confident or how concerned is the scientific community about the Indian Overseas Territories marine buyout? That the level of enforcement under Mauritian sovereignty will be able to combat the pressures of illegal fishing in that area?
So 3 things. We've shared the research in the right way to support that. So the Mauritian government are able to go in knowing what pressures they face from the science that we've done. The second is looking at options for nature-based financing. That it is complicated there, but it's possible, and there's a report which I'm happy to share that we have done at ZSL to say these are options which would produce the finance, and then there's strategies for enforcement, which are, there's a suite of options and tools out there, and we have connected, the Mauritian government is connected with the providers of those tools, and then really it's for them. It's not my decision, but they are equipped to make those decisions and to be aware of how much that costs and different approaches. Obviously, whatever negotiations happen on how that works, the previous announcement talked about an intent to work together for the UK and Mauritius, and that would be certainly a positive thing. Certainly just handing over the keys is going to be extremely challenging of an area that's 640,000 square kilometres of ocean, and where we know in COVID, when the enforcement couldn't be done, poaching went up 19 times. So it's an opportunity, obviously, for poachers to come in if they see this, but there's pluses and minuses because of the bilateral relations with different governments and how that can be used to address some of the fishing pressure, which we know exactly where it comes from and why.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. I think it's worth saying that both this committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee are very conscious of this, already had discussions with government on this matter, so it's not something that we're blind to at all. Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Chair. As the marine environment changes, how can the UK ensure that it's providing protection to species that may be displaced or migrating to different areas than they'd ordinarily live in, for example, migrating north to warmer waters if they become hotter?
Things are already moving, obviously, and entire fisheries have moved, and entire species are moving. I think one specific recommendation would be for the UK to ratify the High Seas Treaty, because those species pretty immediately go out into the high seas, and until we have a mechanism for protection of those species in what's over half of the surface of the ocean and a lot more in 3D, then we're always going to struggle with 30 by 30 until we get to that point, and it won't be sort of fully representative either. I think we need to link up the science with the practice. So talking to colleagues at ZSL who work on cetaceans around the UK, there's a lot of small porpoises and dolphins that are moving. That's going to start to lead into encounters with fisheries that haven't encountered them before. there's opportunities to be ready for that, to work on bycatch mitigation that's happening in current communities. And then also looking at that connectivity in corridors and where the threats are to those species. So, for example, we know, corridors for where sea turtles move, where cetaceans move. There are examples in the US where the movement of cetaceans has put them smack into a shipping lane. And so then there's had to be a discussion with industry about how you shift that shipping lane to stop hitting whales, which isn't good for anybody, and obviously particularly not the whales. So we need, so there is that, those examples where it is that future planning, but with specific recommendations. And then obviously from those communities that are dependent on that marine resource, if that's changing dramatically, living in a highly uncertain Cornish tourism, weather situation, etc., is what, how do you plan for an uncertain future? And we know that it is becoming more unpredictable. So how do you deal with that? And what does that mean for people who depend on the ocean? And what does it mean for biodiversity? It might mean also thinking creatively about protected areas that move and in protected areas that protect specific species at life stages, which is quite a familiar concept for things like migratory birds, where we know that we've got some amazing protected areas in the UK for species that are travelling globally. So we need to think about that more in the ocean.
And we do have... we have some good science that is quite good at predicting and projecting, and it's not solid, but we can think about where those climate refugia might be, that might be better places to potentially think about as protected areas now, if we're designating now, or being prepared to adapt to. So I'd mentioned particularly the project M Space, which is part of the Sustainable Management of Marine Resources programme led out of Plymouth Marine Laboratory. They've got some very complicated modelling that actually looks all around UK waters at where pressures are going to be in the future, and I think we can make better use of that science. I know JNCC and others are using some of those models.
Is there any kind of specific mechanisms that you think would be helpful to ensure that the flexibility and adaptability?
I think it's that sort of, how can we, I'm not enough of a governance expert to know how we build in bylaws or things that would allow for temporal closures that would sort of say, actually, at this point we need to be prepared and willing to put in temporal closures or to change boundaries of MPAs and go, what was fit for purpose 5 years ago is now no longer fit for purpose for species that we might think are important now, particularly those migratory species.
Yeah, I think monitoring came up earlier as being critical, is that if we're unable to effectively and consistently monitor our protected areas over time, then those changes are going to be harder to detect or dependent on a PhD student who happened to do their project there. And what we need is that reliability of knowing through changes in government and policy that we've got those standard monitoring sentinel sites or whatever that are resourced so that we know and can anticipate change and be ready for it. But there's a lot of predictive modelling and a lot of science out there that can be used to inform decision making for sure.
And a strange question, but how are you going to make sure that species aren't wrongly deemed as invasive because they're moving? Does that make sense? And how do you maintain protection if they're new to someone's environment and they're eating something that they're concerned about protecting? Do you know how? It sounds quite complicated. How do you keep up with nature to make sure that they're protecting the right thing in that situation?
I think that's a lot about actually kind of just adapting to climate change. Climate, we can't we've gone beyond being able to entirely mitigate. We are now going to have to adapt, and that means we're going to have to start thinking differently about species that we would previously have said, oh, well, that's an invasive, and start actually accepting that that's now naturalised. And the seagrass that I have is a slight example of that. Wrong seagrass, wrong place, but hey, who's what's not to like kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think it's important to think, know that nature can recover. If we just took a minute to look out the window, we're in London on Sea, and that was biologically dead in the 1950s, and it's now got, over multiple species, including seahorses, sort of swimming.
And seals.
There we go, and seals and seahorses. So, I think the tools that we have at the moment are things like, protected areas, and that's why we're encouraging more highly protected areas that allow for us to build some resilience. Because, if you take Chagos, it's fully protected, it's enormous, it's very far from everywhere. In 2015, 2016 global and bleaching event, we lost 60% of the corals, they died. And last year, in the 4th global bleaching event, we lost 23% of the corals, they died. So that is why the climate change and biodiversity agendas are interlinked, until there's sort of, what else do you do there except please deliver the Paris Agreement? What we can do is actually get rid of invasive rats off islands, which we've learnt through science will help the coral reef. So there's short-term actions that we can take, but we have to use the tools we've got available, and that's where running the science alongside the practice, but not being held up by that, is so important.
And kind of finally, because I'm aware of time, how do you feel that the information that kind of allows policymakers and regulators to make decisions is the right information and of adequate quality? And do you think the guidance that is produced provides sufficient protection for the species that migrate?
Probably know more about the migratory ones than I do.
Sorry, can you say that question?
Do you think that policymakers and regulators are getting the right information to be able to make good quality decisions in relation to species that migrate?
I'd probably ask the other way around, is whether the policymakers are getting the right information for science. I think we have a bit of a blockage in that the currency of science is peer-reviewed scientific papers, which can be dull to read and intensive to keep up with, and even if you work in a narrow field with publications all the time, it's really hard to keep on top of the literature. So I think the question is how scientists can work more closely in this interdisciplinary to say what information do you need and how do you need it? Is it what's the right way to present the information? Because the data or the science is often there. It's perhaps not available or not in the right format. So
it'll be accessible.
So we need to think better about how we make, so whether that's, so the format of providing the right science and consolidating science and also keeping it scientific, i.e. it's not a lobbying tool, it's a balance. This is what we know, good and bad. And, or one position and another, and this is where there's certainty and uncertainty to inform policy, and very happy to take briefs on what's the most useful for you.
It's quite an interesting question because it makes me think about, is there enough transparency about the information that is used and built within government bodies that do make decisions, and where is the challenge going on? So as academics, we're challenged by peer review for all of our papers. And I've been in organisations which have had external challenge to review, are we actually delivering in the best way? And I do wonder whether from that kind of science information, whether there is actually a role for a bit more, constructive challenge.
I think I've got a scientific background. I think my personal view is that government quite often doesn't realise that science is sometimes a debate that's continuing as well. So they'll get one paper and they'll go, that's
the one. Yeah.
And actually, it's the iterative process of science.
And whether it's through collaboration, which is obviously probably the optimum way, or whether it's through actually structured challenge, I'm not quite sure. It could be, ideally it would be a collaboration so that people are continuously informed, or it's, as I say, potentially through constructive challenge.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, both of you, Professor Austen, Professor Koldewey, for the evidence that we've heard today. Brings this latest session to a close. This sitting is suspended. Order, order.